So we've been talking about this I am statement of Jesus. I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. And last time we met, which wasn't last week but the week before, we put this in the context of the story in John chapter 9.
10:40.
We put it in the context of the story of the blind man in John chapter 9. And I wanted to visit that again, looking again at the story, which is a familiar story. We read it, I think, in its entirety last time, which I won't do today. But there are a number of important points, I think, that we touched on perhaps last week, but didn't elaborate on. I'd like to do that today. Notice, first of all, that the disciples see the blind man as an opportunity to discuss theology. They ask the question, who sinned, the parents or the blind man? This speculation about the sins of others seems to be a highly human characteristic. This is something that we frequently fall into, I think, as frail human beings, the desire and the tendency to speculate and to analyze the lives and particularly the sins of others. Jesus, on the other hand, sees the blind man in a completely different light. He sees the opportunity here to be restorative, to be recreative, to aid the blind man and to put him and bring him back to the light. The initiative for healing, interestingly, is that of Jesus's alone. Notice that in this story, unlike many other stories of the healing of Jesus, this blind man does not ask for healing. Jesus sees the blind man. He recognizes the plight that he's in. He basically walks up to him and begins to put the spittle and the clay together and put it on his eyes. Interestingly enough, that in this case, the desire to go from darkness into the light is not mitigated by the person's desire. But Jesus sees him as a person in darkness who needs the light. Again, questions related to topics that we've discussed concerning the will and our role in seeking the light. There is, in most of the other stories of the healing, evidence that the person has sought Jesus out for healing, but this is a different case. Jesus sees the need and he puts the blind man's situation in the context of what he sees there and decides to heal him on his own. The healing was also not marked with a great deal of simplicity like it is in several other places. In Matthew chapter 9, Matthew chapter 20, there's stories of healing of the blind men. And in each case, they seek healing, and Jesus simply tells them that they're healed and their eyes are opened. In this case, there's something quantitatively and qualitatively somewhat different. Here he has to make the clay, and he takes the spittle and he puts it into their eyes. Is this a hearken back, as we said before, to the dust from which we are created? Here is the recreation of sight. Is it, as Michael has, I think, suggested in the past, a type of burial in the ground and resurrection out of the earth? Whatever is signified when the blind man returns from the pool of Siloam, where he's been sent to wash off, Jesus is long gone. So this is again an interesting part of the story. He receives his sight remote from Jesus. The work that Jesus did, whatever that was, the application of the poultice of clay and its washing, it takes place remote from where Jesus is. In addition, leaving the blind man, this occurred to me this week as I was rereading the story, leaving the blind man with clay on his eyes puts him in a position where he has really no alternative but to wash his eyes. It doesn't take faith to go to the pool of Siloam and wash your eyes when your face is a mess. This is a natural response to the fact that you've got clay on your face, and so it's not even a test of his faith. Jesus doesn't say to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam, and your eyes will get your eyesight will return." He puts the clay on there, makes a mess out of his face, and now if you didn't even say what to do, you'd expect that the blind man would have to go and wash in order to get the clay off. If Jesus would have simply told him to go and wash in the pool, he would have had no choice, or he would have had a choice, but now he really has no choice. Leaving the clay all over your eyes, even when you're blind, seems to reduce the option of washing, and even without faith, washing would be necessary just to clean up the mess. In verse 13, we see that Jesus gives the blind man his sight, but the Pharisees give the blind man a hearing. And this is, of course, the natural way in which the Hebrew economy works. Any discussion concerning whether or not a person is healed from an illness has to take place in the temple. The Pharisees have to make a judgment that the person is fit for re-entry into the community of faith, as opposed to being ostracized or outside based on their illness. We see this story in the story of the lepers. We see this here in the story of the blind man as well. The temple rulers make the call concerning if one is healed. Illness, even natural monthly cycle of the female, these are all associated with isolation, and the reversal of this isolation requires that they bring him to the Pharisees, who interrogate him concerning his recovery of sight. They're unsatisfied with his responses, and they call him to an oath of truth-telling in verse 24. In verse 24, so the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." This phrase, "give glory to God," is not as it may appear at first, and that is that they're equating Jesus with God and therefore saying, "Give glory to him for your healing." This is really a call to some kind of oath of truth-telling. That is to say something which is true on an oath to God, that what you're proclaiming is true. The man, of course, has no insight whatsoever into his healing, just that whereas before he walked in darkness, now he walks in light, and that's all he really can say. He has no comprehension about the meaning of this event. He has no way to interpret this event beyond the very simple notion that what he has experienced was blindness before, and now the ability to see. He could not divine the meaning of this miracle behind his healing. He knew only that he could see. And I was thinking that maybe if we talk about stages of faith, which we've talked about many times in this class, this might be the experience of a stage 1 individual, is that they don't have a lot of insight into how they make a transition into the light, but they only know that whereas before they walked in darkness, now they can walk in light. That's all that they really can comprehend. His discussion with the Pharisees and his exasperation with them comes out in verse 27, as they continue to ply him with questions concerning who did the healing and how did this occur. And he answered them and said, verse 27, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you?" Kind of a sassy character. You kind of like that, don't you, Karen? This word "too," T-O-O, suggests that he himself has already become a disciple of Jesus, at least in his own mind. He's interrogating them whether or not they would like to become a disciple as well. Notice that the data set that the Pharisees were working with didn't fit their preconceived ideas as to what a Messiah should be. They were looking for loopholes in the story so that they could rationalize the data which they had with their preconceived notions of what healing it was all about, what the Messiah should be all about, and more importantly, what the truth about God would be all about, and how they might take the information which they were seeing and they were experiencing, and how they could fit it in to their paradigm of truth as they saw it. How could it be that this sinner, Jesus, who was a lawbreaker, a Sabbath breaker, could be a tool in God's hands? It simply wasn't possible in their mind. It didn't fit into their paradigm. The notion that they should somehow reassess their data, somehow that they should question whether or not the data set they were working with, their paradigm of understanding that they were dealing with, that it should somehow come into question or perhaps be altered in some way, didn't even cross their mind. This is the we see part of that Jesus points out in verse 41. Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say, we see, your sin remains." What they could see was their paradigm. What they could see was their truth about God. What they understood was things that they had historically been taught, positions which they had kept for centuries. A true knowledge of God involves humility to reassess our data set about God. Intransigently clinging to a data set, even in the face of new evidence, is the claim to sight that Jesus says, in this case in verse 41, is sinful. It's a claim to rely on a paradigm which is no longer able to be rationalized with the new data. The giving of sight to the blind man was considered in the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures to be the work of the Messiah. This is explained prophetically in Isaiah 29, verse 18, Isaiah 35, verse 5, Isaiah 42, verse 7. So all of these Pharisees who understood and who had studied the Hebrew Scriptures should know that the giving of sight to the blind is a work of the Messiah, and yet they could not rationalize this with the fact that Jesus could be the Messiah. In fact, if you look at the miracles of Jesus, he has more miracles concerning the healing of sight or the recovery of sight from the blind than any other type of miracle. And this, I think, is no accident, given the fact that this is one of the defining characteristics of the Messiah. The notion by the Pharisees of who the Messiah would be, their picture of God, as it were, was so static that in their mind it was unalterable, and they couldn't rationalize or in any way reconcile what they were seeing with their preconceived notion. The story, in summary, contrasts two responses to a knowledge of God. The blind man looks at the data and concludes that Jesus is God, even though he has no or very little insight or understanding as to what that really means. The Pharisees look at the same facts, and because of their preconceived notions, because of their understandings, they reject a new truth about God. Walking in the light, it seems, is strongly linked to humility and to an assertion that I was blind, but now I see. And in verse 25, he says in the simplest terms, "There is only one thing I know." He therefore answered, "Whether he is a sinner I do not know. Only one thing I do know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. This is a humble admission of very little knowledge. One thing only, that he was able to be, he was in darkness, now he is able to be walking in the light. The claim to know God, the claim to speak for God, the claim to be in God's service is a risky business, and is potentially an intellectual violation of the second commandment, which prohibits the making of images of God. And as I've said before, while we've always assumed that the second commandment prohibited the making of graven images out of stone and precious metals and so forth, it is, I think, as well, maybe even more so, a prohibition against making God into our own image, making God into an image that is something that is of our own devising and is of our own imagination. That when we do so, we risk, I think, putting ourselves in the position of God and making ourselves the declaration that we see, that we know, that we understand God, and in doing so, as Jesus says here, this is really the sin of arrogance. So I'd like your thoughts considering again the story of the blind man, the healing of the blind man, the response of the Pharisees concerning light and darkness, the truth about God, what we know about God and what we can claim about God. And I wondered, what is it that we really can know about God, and how much should we know, do you think, about God? One of the things that I find interesting is that very strong in the Christian tradition is the notion that we ought to share our faith, that we ought to evangelize, we ought to take the Great Commission of Matthew 28 seriously, to take the gospel of the kingdom to all the world, and that there is a compulsion to share things about God, and yet here it seems that what we share about God and how intransigently we share that, and how we decide on the knowledge of God, seems to be somewhat drawn into question by Jesus. Finally, I would just point out that in our discussion of Jesus as the light of the world, we see light as a very general object. Light is not particulated very well, meaning what you see with light is an overwhelming sense, but it is not it's not high definition. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. But in the new heaven and the new earth, I was thinking about this week as well. In Revelation 4 and in Revelation 10, we see that the light in heaven is a rainbow. It's a rainbow around the head of God, and it's a rainbow around the throne of God. It's as if somehow the refraction of that light in the new heaven and the new earth is qualitatively different than just a blob of brightness. And I wondered what, if anything, that might mean to your understanding about God as well. What are your thoughts about light and darkness, the story concerning the blind man, what it is that we should know about God, data sets and how data sets change, what we ought to be able to say about God, and maybe even most importantly, how do we share our view of God, our knowledge of God, with others in a way which is effective and not misleading to others.